So this morning, I just wanted to talk a little bit about parent-teacher cooperation. Um, if we compare ourselves to neurotypical families, which is a term I like to use because at the end of the day, I believe there's no such thing as normal. So our children with ADHD are what we call neurodiverse, and everybody else is neurotypical. So if we compare ourselves to neurotypical families, we often find that we feel we need to be a lot more involved in school than others. And there's a lot of conversation in the last few years about helicopter parenting. And it's something I struggle with. Like, when do I know if I'm helicopter parenting, or when do I know if I'm actually genuinely doing something useful? So the first slide is basically just to think about some of the reasons why we need to advocate more when we're dealing with our children with ADHD. And essentially, we all know this, a bad school experience in school is really detrimental for our children's mental health. So success at school is actually nearly a form of therapy for our children, because if we can keep their self-esteem intact and keep their mental health intact, that obviously sets them up for a successful life, which is ultimately what we're trying to achieve here. And we also know that our children's executive functioning is developing 30% behind their peers, which means that at the end of the day, as the requirements of school go up, their executive functioning seems to fall behind, in the sense that they're not developing the skills as fast as their peers are. So when you're in kindy and pre-primary, even year one, that gap isn't that large. But by the time you've got to year 5 and 6, and obviously in high school, it becomes even more noticeable. The other kids have developed skills that our children haven't developed yet. So educating the school and the teachers about what's going on is really, really important. We also know that 50% of children with ADHD will also have some form of learning difficulty. So that's dyslexia, dysgraphia, or dyscalculus. Now, also, we know that unfortunately learning difficulties aren't fully supported in schools here. There isn't funding for it. Although the schools have got a lot better in primary schools at filling that gap, it's also a real, it's at the end of the day, it's a learning difficulty. And what else are children in school for? Only to learn. So you have that additional complication for children with ADHD. And that executive function delay will often impact more negatively than even ADHD symptoms. So as a lot of you have experienced, even socially, our children may struggle more than others because they don't develop those skills as fast. I often see that more with females. So the females go through this phase, neurotypical phase, where the girls become very pack-like, and they all, that being like each other is really, really important. But our children are by default different because their brains tick differently, and also because their executive functioning delays are there. So often they'll find that they might be outcast at a certain stage in school. So again, just being conscious of that and making the school conscious of that. Your child's teacher may not be aware of an IEP. If it's in place, they may not be aware of it, or in some schools, it may not even be in place yet. So advocating to get an IEP, that's that individual education plan, where hopefully you may be able to get some accommodations agreed, where the teacher will actually be able to do things that will support your child. The other thing is, obviously last year's teacher often won't have the resources and hand over to this year's. I see there's a mistake there, my 6 and 7, it's actually all one line. And the last point then is, if it's not going well in the first few weeks, sticking your head in the sand won't actually solve it. I know it's so tempting sometimes not to have to deal with it, but really what I have found is solving it and trying to deal with things in the first few weeks can pay massive dividends for the future, if for the rest of the year anyway. So basically, how do we get the teacher on our side? I really think that we need to go in solution focused, not problem focused. Now, you do get some teachers who naturally, because of their own limitations or even just their own personality, will often be very problem focused. So I think it's our job to actually switch them to solution focused. So what I'm talking about that is, if they come up with something that's a real problem, then you need to guide them towards it. Right, I fully appreciate where you're coming from. Let's see if we can find a solution for that. Having a proactive approach, not reactive. So again, what you often have with these children, with our children, is they come home from school and they tell us a story about something that's happened, and we react to it rather than actually taking stock, sitting back and going, okay, what's the broader picture here? What's the broader solution to it? And having that more proactive approach will generally reap better benefits. if we can give assistance and solutions to the teacher, you will often get that help back. And even certainly in primary schools in the lower years, often teachers will actually put their hands in their pockets to give resources and supplies to the actual classroom. So maybe consider some practical solutions and maybe offering some practical supplies, particularly in those early years. Find opportunities to give compliments by actually noticing the positives in the classroom. So for example, some teachers are really awesome in terms of their artwork, and they do some really fabulous stuff, and they have really creative stuff up around the classroom. So noticing that and actually finding opportunities to actually praise the teacher, but obviously finding ways to do it genuinely. Showing empathy by genuinely putting yourself in their shoes. I genuinely have enormous empathy for teachers this day and age, in terms of the class size they have, the issues they have to deal with in the classroom, the knowledge that, my child is not the only one they're actually struggling with. But equally, it's obviously very important that we advocate for them. But I think it's about, if we can actually genuinely put ourselves in their shoes, we have a better chance of actually genuinely being empathetic to their position, which then means you're on the same side rather than on opposite sides dealing with the problem. If you can volunteer your time anywhere you can, I know obviously the opportunities for that are seriously limited as a result of COVID at the moment, but hopefully our mask wearing won't last forever. We can go back to volunteering time. And one of the huge benefits of volunteering your time, it gives you a really good sense of how your child is doing in the classroom, an opportunity to actually observe them when they're actually there, observe them how they're doing with classwork, and observe them how they're doing socially. Respecting the teacher's time constraints. For some teachers, meeting first thing in the morning works really, really well. Personally, I always hated that because I'm not a morning person. I was much better by the end of the day, but it's about working out what the best time is for the teacher and actually finding that time to talk to them. And finding the most effective method of communication as well. Some teachers really hate if you email them. Some teachers only want you to email. Some teachers obviously do better on a phone. Now, again, I'm really conscious that face-to-face opportunity is seriously limited, but there are other ways of doing it, like using WhatsApp, for example, as a video calls. It's a really great way to at least get that face-to-face contact. And WhatsApp is a free, very commonly used application. So maybe just some tips then if we actually manage to have a meeting, and then obviously the meeting can be virtually, because in this day and age we're often, well, certainly most schools are not allowing parents into the school currently. It's trying to be positive. I know it's incredibly hard when you're frustrated with what's going on and your child is suffering, but going in with a positive approach will just essentially not get the teachers' backs up. If we go in negatively and we accuse them or we're angry with them, it's a natural reaction for people, all people, but particularly for teachers, to be defensive on that. I honestly think over the years of watching teachers, they do deal with an awful lot of negativity. And so often they're just defensive, just even starting that conversation. So if you can try and start the conversation from a positive point of view and keep it on a positive track, again, it will get more dividends. Again, depending on the age of your child, but certainly from the age of probably year 4 up, certainly year 5, 6 and up, you definitely need to be involving your child. Maybe not necessarily bringing them to the meeting, depending on your teacher's ability to be able to be positive in that meeting. There's absolutely no advantage to bring a child to a meeting if the teacher is not capable of being positive. But if you can trust the teacher to be quite positive in their approach, bringing the child to the meeting is a really good way of engaging them and getting them involved in accommodations and the solutions. But even if that's not possible, and even if it is, I was to always sit down with my child in advance and talk about, okay, what are you finding really difficult at the moment? And then getting their take on what might be a potential solution, because your child is the one who's in the classroom every day. And they may actually have solutions that you can present to the teacher and might actually solve the problem. And try and be specific when talking about a concern. So for example, if your child is spending hours at homework and it's causing huge tension and huge frustration at home, then maybe keeping a record of how much time he or she is actually spending on homework and going in with that data and say, look, this is the amount of time he's actually spending trying to do his maths. What can we do about that? Because if you give a teacher the actual problems, then often they'll be able to focus more on a solution for it. And if you feel your child's teacher isn't able to provide any accommodation, then you really do need to ask for an evaluation by somebody else, be it the principal or the school psychologist or somebody else, or even if you have access to a professional who you can ask to input into what's going on in the classroom. Sadly, it is a fact of life that I talked about the helicopter parenting in the beginning. Some teachers do tend to believe that we are helicopter parenting. So again, it depends on the personality of the teacher. Some teachers do respond better when you bring another professional in terms of this is what's actually would work better for my child. And no matter how cordial a meeting is, I advocate seriously for keeping a record of what's actually been said, what's been agreed, and so that you actually have that to reference to at the next check-in date. I used to actually write notes and send an email saying this is what we actually agreed. So you then, there's a phrase that if you're the note taker, you're in control of what's actually recorded, but it is actually true. So if you keep a record of what's been agreed and then you send it to them saying this is what we've agreed, it also gives you evidence that you have been proactive, and maybe keeping it all in one place, keeping in one file, so that, and maybe keeping NAPLAN results and everything else all in the one place, so you can take it with you when you're going to a meeting. If you need to refer back to something, you'll actually have it all in the one file. And then making sure you agree a check-in date. So ideally, you should have some sort of a formal meeting with your teacher once a term. What I hear often happens, particularly in primary school, is parents don't get notified till term 4 that there's a problem. And the cynic in me thinks sometimes it's because the teachers know they have no resources to solve it. So by not actually dealing with it until talking about it in term 4, then essentially there's an element of, well, the year is over now, we can pass it on to the next year. But obviously that can often be too late for our children in terms of actually solving problems in the moment. So trying to agree a check-in date and making sure they stick to it.